crazy.
It is crazy. So.
It's crazy.
I'm just going to leave this right here so we can shed light on the history, the past, and hopefully bring light to the future.
I love it, Dwayne. That's a
Thank
great
you,
way. It's a great way to get started today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Yes, yes. So we are excited today to, first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining. I see some new faces, but faces that are newly familiar to me. I have some actually client friends joining today. So thank you all for being here. Very excited that we are bringing our guest speakers back. And so I'm Tiffany Castagno, CEO and founder of Sefer LLC. And I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Suman Kapoor, who is CEO and founder of Well Balanced Solutions. And today we are joined by Dr. Tanisha King. But before we kind of kick off here, I just want to say that today is a special day. It is a holiday for Sefer, and now it's actually also a federal holiday in the U.S. So today's Juneteenth, and we want to just start by welcoming you all, thanking you for being here, and what an honor it is that we get to spend this day, particularly together as it marked the end of slavery. We finally got this passed. I can't believe it's taken this long, but as we always talk about in this series, we're definitely excited for change, and it sometimes comes slow, right? But this is why we're here. So I want to tell you a bit about Dr. King today, who is joining us. So I'm just going to read her bio verbatim so that I don't do it any injustice. So Dr. Tanisha King is an author, public speaker, and consultant, as well as a 3-time alumna of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. King currently serves as the Chief Inclusion Officer for the Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine at Ohio University, where she is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Social Medicine. Additionally, she is an adjunct professor at Southern New Hampshire University, where she teaches a PhD level social change course. Previously, Dr. King has taught at the undergraduate and graduate levels at the University of Illinois and Fordham University, and served their communities through volunteerism as members of various boards of directors. Dr. King has been featured in multiple news and radio outlets and appeared in the 2017 Virginia theater performance, That's What She Said. She spoke to an audience of over 5,000 people at a women's march in the state of Illinois and won a political seat as a member of the Champaign County Board. Her inaugural book, Out of Battle into Freedom, was featured at an NAACP author pavilion and has been described on Amazon as a must-read. What a great honor we have for that today, and particularly Juneteenth. Dr. King is the founder of Dr. King Speaks, LLC, where she helps organizations move from performative to transformative diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, as well as empowers women to defy odds and overcome obstacles through radical self-love. Her podcast, The Tanisha King Show, discusses politics, social justice, women empowerment, and more. So welcome, Dr. King. We are so grateful to have you here today with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you all to continue the race conversation. I love the work that you all are doing, and I'm happy to see the wonderful, vibrant audience members, even from afar, as you travel and enjoy the day. I am going to share with you today, before we jump into a more robust conversation, a slight history of white power and privilege in the U.S. context, specifically as it relates to race. I want to kind of paint this picture in terms of how our country was founded. Far too often, I think, as U.S. citizens, we sweep under the rug these very critical things that continue to be pervasive in our world today. And so our socialization specifically is rooted in our history, right? And none of us are apart from it. We are informed socially, economically, culturally, and politically by decisions made in our government, past, present, and future. The decisions that our social leaders have made impact who we are and how we think about particular demographics and groups of people in society today. And so however you identify, your ancestors and family history has unfortunately been implicated in some form or fashion by white supremacy, or actually promoted by it. It's uncomfortable often, especially for those that are not identifying as people of color, and we rarely want to take responsibility for it, right? And none of us are responsible for creating racism. right? None of us were there when some of these things started, but we do, as a society, as human beings, have a responsibility, I believe, to address it and to eliminate some of the isms that followed it. We have to be honest and acknowledge what and how this country was founded on, and how this history, again, continues to inform, impact, and perpetuate oppression today. So when we think about things such as colonialism, the taking of native land, when we think about genocide and the heinous murders and killings of particular demographic groups strictly because of their racial and ethnic origin and background, when we think about slavery and this inhumane way of doing and being for capitalism purposes. And my expertise lies within slavery, Civil War, Jim Crow, microaggressions, and diversity, equity, inclusion abroad. So I wanted to be sure to include, though, colonialism and genocide, because that very much is a part of our history and are still perpetuated in today's society as well. But I wanted to take a moment to stop at slavery when we talk about the race conversation. Again, we a lot of the times like to push that to the backside because it happened so long ago. It was so long ago, slavery is over. We had a Black president, y'all, if you weren't aware. So post-racial is where we should be now. But that is absolutely not the case. We've been conditioned and indoctrinated into a society that has conditioned us to believe certain things, certain stereotypes about particular groups. And that did start with slavery. And some will say, well, Tanisha, there were tribes in Africa that enslaved each other, right? So this is just a world and a human problem, and white supremacy and white oppression has nothing, to do with that. And I would disagree. And I would say that the tribes that chose to use slavery as a means of capitalism and other things in their space did not take away what the transatlantic slave trade took away from people: identity, name, roots, culture, right? And the way in which those folks that were enslaved during that transatlantic slave trade differed greatly from the treatment that tribes in Africa did. And so I think that is important as a part of the conversation when people attempt to assert, look, everyone was doing it. No, right? It was done very differently, and what was taken away was much greater. And how that particular slavery occurred still impacts our world today in really significant ways, both internal to the African American community and external to it, right? So when we think about things that are still happening in present day, specifically gentrification and the moving of people from particular geographical areas, leaving from their homes, when we think about redlining and separating and dividing groups of people, specifically in territories, a lot of that started as a result of slavery and then following Jim Crow, right? Keeping this separatism and division going. And that's kind of external to the African American community. Internal to that, from slavery specifically in Jim Crow, is colorism and shadeism. Right? So when you think about the African American community and this privilege that exists with lighter skinned Black folks and or family dynamics, and how darker skinned Black children and darker skinned Black women specifically are treated within the household and or in the school system, is a direct derivative of slavery, because there were field slaves and there were house slaves. And the house slaves, because they were lighter skinned, were treated well and were allowed in the house, where the field slaves did more of the hard work and worked specifically in the fields. And so we are still today having remnants of that conditioning that we were forced into as a result of slavery, despite how long ago that it was. And it's really critical that we continue the conversation related to race and incorporate slavery and how our society was founded, because it still perpetuates and impacts the way in which we move today. We did not just kind of fall into these injustice policies and practices. We were given it, and we are continuing to make it pervasive in today's world. And then we often want to say, not only was it long ago, but I didn't do it, right? It wasn't me, and I'm a good person. And so therefore, I don't use the M word. I'm not a part of any hate group or the KKK. And so I'm doing fairly well. It's not my problem. I don't see color. I'm great, and people are great, and I treat everyone the same. There's an inherent issue with that, because a lot of the times we are part of the problem, even on a micro level. right? When we think about interrupting isms in the workspace and the position and power and authority that someone has in the workspace. If we look at the C-suite, where white men typically are filling those seats, what power, position, and authority do you have to ensure that there's additional diversity at the table? How are you looking at your policies, practices, and procedures to ensure there's a sense of belonging for the diversity that you do have? Right? What does that look like in the space, and how can you utilize your voice and position of authority in order to influence that change, even on the micro level? So often we are bringing who we are and what we've learned into the spaces that we're in. We've been socialized not only by the founding and these events, horrific events that have taken place in our culture and in US history, but we're also shaped and informed by where we grew up, who our parents were, what institutions we were a part of, what did our church, if we are religious and or spiritual, what did it teach, and how did that inform the way in which we behave in these spaces, right? And a lot of the times when we think about change, I always liken it to exercising. Like, Tanisha should have exercised this morning, but she did. And it's hard to kind of develop a new routine, but when you think about a mindset, right? Like, and shifting a mindset and choosing to be open to new ways of thinking when you've been socialized from your family, from your institutions by US history to think a certain way, you're often bumping up against a brick wall. I also liken it to the movie American History X, if folks have seen that movie, and the influence of your parents. This movie would follow two white males in the area that they lived in high school, and they had a white racist father who often shared propaganda with them and racial stereotypes specific to African American men, and the influence that that had on them and how that shaped the trajectory of their future, right? And it didn't all lie just in the parent, but that was the foundation of their learning and where they were getting their information from. And so we often don't want to brush up against our mom or father. We love them. Why would I choose to interrupt that or risk and sacrifice this relationship? But I'm here to say that it's 2021. And at this point, we have been fighting with the same injustices over and over and over and over again. And it's going to take allies and advocates and co-conspirators to interrupt these isms that we face. And that means potentially sacrificing relationships with the people that we love. And it's also going to mean calling out things that are meant to be good and that mean well, and look at, regardless of intention, we're going to looking at impact. Tiffany mentioned that Juneteenth, and that we have this win that we want to celebrate because Juneteenth is now a federally recognized holiday. And that is wonderful. It acknowledges that freedom did not happen for everyone at the same time, right? And it acknowledges what that looks like. And now we celebrate it and we're going to get an extra day off. Hallelujah. Love it, right? However, what does that mean for the trajectory of justice in the future? How does that shape where we're going? Or does it? Does it serve as a placeholder to pacify and distract, or does it really implicate something more to come? When we look at certain states that are eradicating and removing critical race theory from education for folks, when we look at lynching potentially still not being illegal, right? When we look at actual laws and policies that need to be rectified, what does making Juneteenth a national federal holiday do for those things? And so I want us to kind of stay in the forefront of that and look at things for what they are. Whether their intentions are good, we have to know that they're making a positive impact for real change and growth. Because what we don't want is for things to be performative. We want them to be transformative as we move forward towards justice.
Those are such great points, Dr. King. One of the things that strikes me as you were speaking is how many people will say that they're colorblind, that they treat everybody the same, that all these things don't matter. And maybe that's true for them in the moment, face to face, but where it will really show is when they have decisions to make in politics, or have decisions to make in their financial world, or any of the other places where their natural discriminatory stuff will actually start to surface.
Thanks for sharing, Dwayne, and Dr. King. So when we're looking at organizations and kind of these structures, right? Like, what differentiates the most successful organizations from those that may not be as successful in their DEI efforts?
Yeah, so You have to have a budget in place. So, right, people put their money to things that are important and significant to them in the space. And so there has to be a budget allocated specifically towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism efforts. That budget should look like having people devoted and committed to getting the work done, like chief diversity and inclusion officers, right? However, the structure also has to be in place. You can have the funds, but you have to have a structure that supports the work that's actually happening, as opposed to having that position as symbolic to look at what we're doing. Look, this is important to us because we have someone leading the efforts. The structure in place looks like having program managers and coordinators that's supporting the work of that chief diversity officer, but then also requiring and mandating that the entire organization is on board. So creating that buy-in up front about what that looks like. At our College of Medicine, we require diversity, equity, and inclusion training. We develop a course and we have modules that folks are expected to complete by June 30th. All faculty, staff, and students are required to participate in that work. And the goal is to inform, educate, but then apply. Right, to be able to apply it to the work that we're doing. We know that there's heinous things that have happened in our medical education system, and we have a strong medical history of things happening to Native, Latinx, and Black women in the healthcare system, and we know what those health disparities are. So as opposed to just watching the modules, no, we want to apply and pull from it. And we also want to make sure that the different departments are adding to the goals that the diversity officer and office of inclusion have established, and that the work does not just fall on that office or on that person in that title, because this work is everyone's work. And in order to really build and sustain a culture of DEIA in any space, it has to be embedded in the fabric of the organization. Right. And so while you have someone and you have the budget and you have the structure and you have a dedicated person leading the efforts, it's critical that you have conversations with various departments and that they set their own goals. Hey, this is the strategic plan, right, that the Office of Inclusion and the CDO has developed. How do you see your department contributing to that plan? And how can you introspectively look at that department and say, hey, we're all male dominated, or we're mostly white. This is how we're going to fold this into our HR practices when openings come around to ensure diversity. But then we're also going to have difficult conversations and dialogue, right? Making sure that you commit to those ongoing efforts and have the departments or individuals in your organizations share what those goals looks like for them. Right. And then that means even if you're mandating trainings, you're not mandating what their goals are. They get to come up with it on their own. And then it spreads kind of like wildfire. And then it'll be touching every single piece in the organization. And so in order to ensure that you're not performative, there has to be substance under it. You can't just sprinkle things in place. You have to continue the conversation, have difficult dialogue, in addition to having accountability measures in place. So the accountability is really has been the struggle for a lot of organizations because freedom of speech and because, right, not wanting to rock the boat. But we have a really robust accountability structure where, right, we define what oppression is, we define what racism looks like, we define what microaggressions in the workplace are, and then we do the trainings on them. And when someone kind of violates the culture that we're trying to go forth, we have individual conversations with them in a very educational and informative way, right? Like, it's not meant to be sent to the principal's office, although some people will take it as that either way. But if those structures aren't in place, we're condoning the behavior. Right. So when we clearly define what racist acts are and what is anti-racism and that's violated, we have something to pull from in order to educate that person on why that was the case. We also ensure that we discuss how it's not about you or me, right? It's not about you, it's about the work and it's about the culture we're attempting to land ourselves here. And then we provide additional resources about learning about why it may not have been okay to say to a student after getting a tan, I'm almost darker than you. Right? We have to confront those things that were explicitly said and say, hey, you know, we know that the intention wasn't good. We know that, right, X, Y, and Z. However, this is what this actually says. This is the subtle message behind that. This is why that's not okay. And then we go from there. And if the folks don't want to be held accountable, they have decisions and choices to make, and so does the organization. But that is the work and that is the sacrifice if you're really going to be committed and devoted to seeing change in the space, because there's always going to be pushback about it because we've lived it a certain way for so long wrong. And so many have gotten to benefit off of the privilege of being able to say and do what you will and what you please at any given time. And so when you are pushed back against that, it can also be a shock. And so the organizations have to have those accountability structure in place in order to be ready to address it.
I love, Tanisha, that you touched on accountability, because that's a piece that I frankly see lacking. And an organization I worked at in the HR department, even, like, it was a joke. Like, we called it the dirty A word, because there was no accountability. People didn't believe in it. Every time you tried to challenge these structures and systems, and it didn't have to be about discrimination or anything like that, but it would be like, oh, kind of like, stay in your place, stay in your lane. That's not for you. And I'm a person who's very outspoken all the time because I believe in doing the right thing. And it's frustrating, and it just further perpetuates the problem, right? When you're told, nope, shut up, be quiet, like, don't make any noise, don't, you're getting a little big for your britches over there because I'm the one who's in power, right? And we don't hold those leaders who may be senior and executive leaders who should be championing the change, and they're part of the problem. And that's an issue.
Yeah, and Tiffany, I was actually going to mention that, so I appreciate you saying that. It also has to be top down, right? And people don't like the top down approach for a number of different reasons in hierarchical worlds. But they also, that top leader, that executive who does all the hiring, all the approving, the very top person has to already have the buy-in and help lead the charge. Right? So I'm not always the one sending the email saying, hey, this is required. No, my executive dean sent it and said, this is required, right? Because it's going to look and sound differently, because it's everyone's job. And so once that happens, it also changes and shifts the mindset for the people that are engaging in the work.
Yeah, I love that. And that's, when you talk about change management too, as a principal, and this is a lot of the work that I'll do with my clients even too, where it's like, okay, well, let's think about like who the message comes from, what is the order of operations, who's sending it, because it sends a very specific message. If it's not from the top, or there's no accessibility or visibility to those folks, people want to know, like, who am I working for, and why, and are they even behind this, or is this just like, the smoke and mirror show? Like, great, you put my face on your company board, now what does it actually mean, right? What is the work? So I love that. So I would love to segue a little bit as we're talking about this, because I love talking about culture. So when it comes down to things like cultural competency, I know you do a lot of work around this. What does it mean to be culturally competent? And maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that probably occurs in organizations as well as in the external environment to the organization. But can you share with us what that means?
Trying to put myself off mute, it wasn't working. So cultural competence is merely having an awareness of value and appreciation for various cultures and identities, specifically within the space and workplace that you're in. And the awareness of it is important because none of us, I don't believe, ever fully achieve cultural competence across the board for every single culture or heritage, right? But it's merely coming in with the mindset that you have an appreciation for things that are different other than you, and that you have a willingness to learn about things that are different than your own. Often when we don't have a particular lived experience, we put ourselves in the box of what's true and what's not, specific to how we were raised or what we were taught or what we actually saw. And I think for America, we definitely are one of those places, if we didn't see it, it didn't happen. Right. And I think that was very evident in the murder of George Floyd and the way in which it was heinously put, the way that it was shown, right, that there was this additional awakening because they saw it. Right. Whereas folks have been living it and saying it forever. And in my mind, why did it take so much? And why did it have to be so heinous before additional alerts went up? And so cultural competence is really being able to look at where you are on this continuum of cultural awareness, right? And it's 6 stages that the National Center for Cultural Diversity has put together, and it really is a continuum. You're either cultural destructive, where you are not seeing color, you're breaking down any efforts, and you're putting up barriers as it relates to learning more about the work and culture of different folks, where you're not allowing yourself to kind of take in the things that are happening and aren't really using it to do and be better, right? And not looking at your system and your institutional directly to promote different ways of being and to minimize any diverse or discriminatory practices, right? And then you have cultural pre-competence, where you're kind of on the edge, you're almost there, you're learning a little bit more about it, you're learning this kind of awareness of these systems and things that are in place that prohibit and inhibit particular groups of people there. And you really don't develop any of the competence without engaging in these dialogues and conversations. And it's making sure that you are aware that these things exist and that you're leaning into the education, that you're having an open mind, and that you're choosing to do some introspection. And I think the cultural pre-competence, when you're starting to do self-reflection and the fact that it starts with us, how we were kind of taught in these systems, and our willingness to kind of remove those barriers to take in more info and say that, hey, I don't know everything. From a cultural humility standpoint, there's always more that I can learn, and there's always more that I can do to become competent in this particular area. And I use the example with me, right, as an African-American woman who grew up on the South Side of Chicago in poverty. It's always important to say South Side of Chicago, because folks that know Chicago know, yes, that, right, it looks different depending on where you are. So my lived experience is particular to that demographic, but I always talk about there's still privileges that I have. There's privilege in my education, right? There's privilege in the resources and networks, but then there's also privilege because I'm an able-bodied woman, right, who is not hard of hearing or deaf, who has her full sight, right? But then there's ways that my bias shows up because of those things. And that privilege kind of takes over. For instance, I just recently started automatically using closed captions on my PowerPoints, right? But before I didn't, because it was not something I had to think about, because it wasn't an issue for me. Right. So my privilege showed up in that way because it's not something I have to think about. And someone had to choose to email me and say, hey, Tanisha, listen, you, right, I think your privilege is showing, that's kind of biased. There's no closed captions. Tanisha did not say, oh, but I meant well, and I'm the diversity officer, so I must know more, and it's okay. No, I said, you know what, you're absolutely right. You should have never had to even come to me with that. I will be sure to make sure that closed caption is there, and we're going to adopt that as a college to ensure that any presentations that we do automatically have that available, in addition to an interpreter, so on and so forth, right? And so cultural competence is also being able to develop a cultural humility to say when you are having bias moments, and that when your privilege is showing, because it's going to consistently show up. It's just about how you choose to address it based on the introspection that you're having. And that means maybe that our egos and prides are pushed to the side, specifically as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism work, because it's not about us. It's about ensuring equity and giving people what they need.
So powerful. I love that. And you can't have one of these conversations without talking about the fact that we all sit with bias. I got into like this kind of healthy debate, because debate can be healthy, with someone that I'm connected to in my LinkedIn network. And he was talking about this particular product that we use for our videos to close caption them. And he was saying, well, I said, well, most of the time I do, but sometimes, I may not. And he was like, well, why wouldn't you? Help me understand the situations. And he was very direct in his approach, but he was also very, he was challenging me, like, tell me what situation that you wouldn't use it. And so that really stuck with me. And like you said, Tanisha, I could have chosen to be like, oh, it's not your choice. Like, you don't tell me what to do. These are my videos, my company, whatever. But I chose to have an open mind, and I chose to understand and listen to his reasons why. Like, I know why, right? But at the same time, I'm like, I sit from a place of privilege of not having to, be negatively impacted from that. And so it wasn't something that I really thought into. Like, I choose, like, oh, today I'm not going to, but should that really be a choice because it impacts someone else from a DEI perspective? So appreciate that. So we were talking before, we talked a little bit about like racism, discrimination, and you brought up like shadeism, colorism, the differences in people's skin tones, right? And specifically even in the Black community. So can you tell us like what's the difference between racism and discrimination and how that kind of plays into shadeism and colorism and how they're related?
Yeah, and that's always a great question because people still go back to everyone has the bias and privileges, which is true, but that very much is the difference between racism and prejudice and discrimination, right? So racism is a structure and it's a set of tools and tactics that are used to oppress people of color, right? And that's embedded within our housing system with housing discrimination. I mentioned gentrification and redlining earlier, but that also looks like attempting to purchasing homes and the discrimination that's kind of embedded within that system and practice. And prejudice and discrimination is just kind of stereotypes and things that we're using to kind of put other folks down, right? But there's no power behind prejudice and discrimination. Right. So, for instance, I had a colleague who visited China recently, and he was like, oh, I understand what some of our white students are saying, that we cater to the folks of color when actually all of us have been discriminated against. When I went to China, I was treated really differently, and it was kind of a bad time, and some folks didn't want to serve me, so on and so forth. And we had to explain that you had to leave the country, sir, to experience that. And then you get to come back to the entire United States of America and never experience that again. Whereas people of color and people of marginalized and oppressed groups are met with this racism and discrimination and prejudice daily, right? So this structure that is set up not only impacts my feelings, right? Because I think a lot of people also see racism, microaggressions as just feelings, right? That you're being sensitive or you're taking things too much to heart. No, it's impacting the test scores that I get in the K through 12 system relative to racism and the structure that's there. It impacts whether I get that housing. It impacts whether I live, if I'm pulled over for racial profiling, right? So there are specific things that only folks of color are going to experience that's literally going to threaten our livelihood. And the way in which we are actually able to walk the world. Prejudice and discrimination are moments that might hurt feelings, right? But it doesn't have power behind it to actually change the trajectory and course of your life. Versus racism, racist practices and structures and systemic racism absolutely has the power to change the course of your life intentionally in a pejorative and negative manner. I always think about this time that I was in high school and we did an exchange program. So I mentioned I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I attended Dunbar, a vocational academy school, predominantly Black, on 39th and King Drive. Participated in an exchange program. I had the pleasure of inviting someone from Naperville High to Dunbar. And I got to walk her through our front door. Our front door was met and riddled with metal detectors and a security guard. Right. So I got to walk her through those doors. And then I got to walk her to our lunchroom during lunchtime, and there were bars on the windows. Then she got to sit in the classes with me with our tethered textbooks. And it was my turn to go visit Naperville High. I met with this whole entire new world. And here I am, I'm like a sophomore or junior, like, oh, where are their metal detectors, right? Where are their bars on the windows? Where are their security guards? Why are their textbooks so much neater and nicer than mine? So that this is the difference, like, right? Systemic racism is embedded in the very fabric and culture of our world. And it starts even in K through 12, and the conditioning and socialization of that is a direct result. And a lot of the times determines the trajectory of our lives in terms of being a product of your environment or not. And even embedded in that was the treatment that this Naperville High girl was getting versus the treatment that we were getting, not just because we had to walk through metal detectors, but because she could get up and walk freely and, for instance, go to the restroom. where the treatment in this other school with me was like, you better not get up out your seat without permission and without far notice. And likely, even with asking, you're going to be told, no, you don't need to go to the bathroom, because you're automatically criminalizing me because of your way in which you've been racialized to think about this particular group of people, which also conditions you as young Black youth in terms of your self-confidence and self-esteem and who you are and how you show up in the world later because of how poorly you've been treated before, right? And that automatically denotes this privilege that some groups have versus this very poor treatment that others has, and then that continues to escalate as we walk throughout life. And so racism is a structure, it's power and oppression. It interrupts the livelihood of people of color, whereas racism or prejudice and discrimination is very much temporary and only truly kind of impacts feelings and thoughts, but does not impact trajectory of life. And the way in which these youth, Black youth particularly in the education system are being conditioned, it kind of intercedes with that colorism and shadeism, because that's how you're starting to think about yourselves, because the treatment you're getting is very different than your white counterparts. And then in the home structure, not only are you being treated like that in school, right? We have disproportionate school suspension as well. And a lot of that is riddled with microaggressions and stereotypes based on the teacher's perception of these young Black youth. But then you do that in the system and in the schoolhouse, and then you go into your own house and your mom is treating you differently, or your brother is calling you dark, right? Like these are things that are happening and taking place in this space still in 2021. I had a co-worker at the University of Illinois that were showing me pictures of her kids, because that's what we like to do. If I could show y'all pictures of my children, I would. I could bring them downstairs and just put them in front of the camera. So she was showing me pictures of her children, and she stops and goes, "Oh, that's my dark child." Right? Like, true story. And Tanisha, being who I am, I said, I wonder why you would introduce her as your dark child, right? And she of course didn't have an answer, but think about, if you're introducing one of your children as the dark child, what does that look like in your home? And what notes and messages is she picking up there, plus picking up at school? And how does that, obviously that's going to impact your well-being and your mentality, your self-esteem, your self-confidence. So it's much deeper than just this one-off, and I went out of the country and got treated poorly. No, right? Though that's a treatment, and that wasn't okay either. It doesn't justify the behavior, but it looks very different than this kind of internalized racism and broader racism happening that's impacting the livelihood and trajectory of folks' lives.
Indeed. Wow. I'm just often, as we Suman and I do here, sometimes we're just like stunned to silence. Like, hold on, let me catch up on that a little bit. There's such power in everything you said. And what strikes me is that we continue to see these structures and systems that perpetuate these things. And there is, at times, just complete lack of awareness or education, or people who have the ability to leverage their platforms to be able to do that. And I'm seeing and hearing so much more in my interactions that more people are doing this. But I continue to be amazed by people who want to just ignore it like it doesn't happen. You're stripping away people's identity and their lived experiences, and it's very dismissive behavior. So I would love for us to get to a spot where it's like, no, let's just, let's acknowledge it. If we acknowledge it and we're aware, then we can understand it. Then we can begin to act on it. Then we become change agents, because together is better. But that's so, it's just so hard for some people to really just, that becomes that barrier that you were talking about, right? Like that initial barrier, which is a struggle. And it's unfortunate, but we're working on it, right? So as we talk about transformation, what's one thing that we can all do? We're very big in this community on our individual impact, but the larger impact as a community too. So what's one thing we can all do to influence that change, to be transformative in our personal and professional lives?
Yeah, I think the very first thing is what we touched on before, is getting out of our own feelings. And sometimes that's hard to do because we're so stuck in this bad good dichotomy, and the book White Fragility talks about that we're so stuck in that I'm a good person, that I want to minimize and dismiss any harm that I may be doing and perpetuating in the space. And once we develop that kind of conscious awareness of our own biases and prejudice, we can choose to interrupt it frequently, right? And it will take as a choice to interrupt it every time, and to have other people that will help check you when you need it, right? That you have good friends and colleagues that will say, hey, you tripping a little bit, right? Like, that wasn't cool, that's not okay, and let's talk about why I don't do that no more. Like, it's important to have those people in our lives that will choose to interrupt that as we continue to work through this honest awareness of our own bias. But also, as I stated before, being an advocate and using your privilege in the spaces that you're in, right? Looking at the injustices that are happening, holding listening sessions with your colleagues of color, right? The power in listening to what the experience is that you're having, because I don't have that experience, right? And I've not had the experience, and I may or not be seeing it happening to you, even if it's in my face, right? And you're thinking like, how could you not know? You see it, right? Listening to what's happening and then using your voice to help make that change occur. And I think there's a difference between doing that as an ally and advocate and being a co-conspirator, right? So being an advocate and ally is like using your voice, interrupting these policies and changes. Being a co-conspirator means risking something. It means using yourself sometimes as a sacrifice in place of the injustice that's taking place on behalf of other folks. I think of the example of Bree Newsom climbing up the pole to take down the Confederate flag. The police were called. The police had planned to tase that pole. There was a white male nearby who did not at all know Bree Newsom personally, right? He saw what was about to happen and chose to come and place his hand on the pole, because he knew that placing his hand on the pole as a white male, that the officers would not tase that pole, nor probably harm him. The likelihood of them harming him over harming her was less. He chose to be a co-conspirator, and he chose to sacrifice and place his body in front of that injustice, right? And so developing an honest awareness of our own biases, prejudice, stereotypes, being an advocate and using the privileged position and power of authority that you have in your space to ensure that folks have a say and a voice, that you're listening to what the concerns are as opposed to sweeping it under the rug, kind of taking it seriously and actually enacting change. I just had a conversation with some differently abled folks in my organization who said, everyone's talking about returning to normal. Returning to normal is oppressive to me, because this flexible workplace and working remotely has enhanced my quality of life. So returning to normal for me is not the same. And so now we're having conversations about accommodations. And should accommodations be a thing, or should there already be things in place where you don't have to jump through a hurdle to get what you need to gain towards equity? So listening can do a great deal, because people want to feel heard and valued, just as we all do. But then when you're in positions of power and authority to actually make the change, it's about taking it further after you hear the issues that are there. And that's just on an individual level, right? That's all of that work introspectively. It's a lot, I know, and it's ongoing, and it's a commitment. It's a lifelong commitment. Once you decide that diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism is important to you, once the veil kind of is lifted and you see these systemic things kind of penetrating every single system, and you're kind of there, and you've chosen to make that commitment, it's a lifelong commitment. It's a continual process internally and externally to continue to fight against it. And so it's really being able to make the commitment there. And yes, someone put good trouble. Absolutely. John Lewis, good trouble. It's very good trouble. And so that's the individual level. On the organizational level, it's looking at those policies, practices, and procedures and assessing very critically whether they allow for equitable access and opportunities. The conversation with the differently abled folks, hey, you're saying return to normal and we have to come back from work, right? You're missing this whole group of people that may need something different, right? Because that's what equity is. It's being able to give people what they need, right? Equality, like we all have the same thing. No, because everyone doesn't need the same thing. We need something different. And sometimes we need a tailored approach in order to give folks what they need. And so looking at those policies to ensure it's equitable, not just equal. And we want to, again, create that climate of dialogue and provide those professional development opportunities, because some people are just unaware. And it took a while for Tanisha in the years I've been doing this work to get there and to accept that no, some people just don't know. Because at first you're like, well, how don't you know? And you get upset, right? That's a waste of time. Sometimes people just don't know. And so this work is about taking the time to give grace when grace is needed, right? If it's not blatant and just absolutely ridiculous, and it's just people needing to have an understanding so that they can develop their own sense of opinion about things. And so making sure that we provide those opportunities to have those conversations in all the spaces that we're in. And me and Tiffany mentioned before, making accountability central, ensuring that there's an actual process in place, a bias incident reporting tool, whatever that looks like, and that it goes up a chain. And ours is fancy. We have flow charts, right? Like we are sure, and we make it transparent, right? That this is what we do. These are the things in place. These are some of the consequences in place in educational opportunities should this kind of be violated. And I think it's absolutely necessary to have those things central in order for change to happen. And then finally, there's obviously things that we have to do on a macro level, societal and cultural, to intervene and ensure that we are seeing some change that we want to see. And that's looking at internally our own cultural communication, our mass media within our institutions. What is represented? What are we saying? Who are we leaving out, right? What picture are we painting? Who is in your C-suite when you look around the table? Because who's at the table means that's the voice that's being promoted. And inherently, if there's only white males or only white people in general, then there's many voices being left out of the conversation. And if you've not had a particular lived experience, you're not going to be able to tailor the work towards what's needed. And then we have to look at social policy and law, rectifying discrimination and promoting equal access on a larger scale. I encourage folks to call their senators. I encourage folks, right? Someone put in the chat, I think it was New Jersey, related to pushing back against the not teaching of critical race theory. That pushback is going to be necessary at the highest level at all times, especially in higher education settings. We are kind of at the helm of what the government tells us to do, right? So when previous leadership was in office and that executive order came down and said, you can't talk about white supremacy and privilege and oppression. Can't do it, right? An entire executive order that's going to inform the work that we're doing and what we are and aren't allowed to do. So it's critical on that highest level that we, use the position of power and authority, but also get in contact with legislators and senators in order to enact the change that we want to see, because often it's informing everything else that we're doing anyway.
Love that. I think, it's so important, and there's just always these common themes that are woven in there. And we say it all the time about budgets and the fact that we're all biased, and that there has to be buy-in from the top and leadership from the top, and that there has to be accountability, and that we have to have these policies, systems, programs, structures for change. And yet we continue to do this, this circle of having these conversations, but they say that repetition is good and practice makes perfect. So while I don't know that we'll ever be perfect, because we are flawed inherently, I think that we're definitely making some strides. And when Suman and I have conversations offline with people, whether they're in our series community or outside of that, we have those opportunities, as does everyone, to really make that change and that impact, even if you feel like it's on a small scale. So a lot of people say, well, this is just my little corner of the world, right? Like, how can I make the type of change that's needed? That's a lot of pressure. I'm never going to be able to do that. And it is a lot to sit with. It's a lot of heaviness. We know we've talked about this on this series. We've all had tears together. And it's a lot, but we have to take one little small bite at a time, and having these conversations and wonderful guest speakers like you who come and help us learn. I know that for as much as Suman and I built this to help others learn, we get so much out of it as well. So I'm so grateful. I can't think of any other questions right now. Suman, do you have any, or do you have some thoughts you want to add on?
I think Dwayne's got a question there.
And
I'm sorry, Dwayne. Sometimes I do my best.
And this is kind of coming from my neighbor, a Hawaiian woman who's grown up here in Maui and Oahu. She works for American Savings Bank. I can't remember her exact title, but I know she's into something about the organizational development training, probably DEI as well. And she's been talking about the fact that now that they're ready to come, quote unquote, back to normal and bring people back into the office, she's already talking to her leaders about the fact that there will be discrimination against those who choose to stay home and are not in the office interacting directly, pressing flesh with people in the way that we were accustomed to in the past. And then as we're talking about it, I'm trying to think, how is that going to be affected for people of color? Will they have the same resources to watch after their children so that they could return to the office? May they not have the resources if they would have to stay at home? How is that going to affect various, even the white folks too? But so who has to stay at home because of the childcare and the costs versus who can afford to go back to the office? How is that going to affect the future?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's why we're having a conversation even in our space. And equity looks like assessing the needs of the employees of your organization and then making those adjustments as it goes, right? So some companies are very kind of fluid in their response and flexible in how they do things, and others are like, hey, we need people in the chairs because we need the organization to run. And so it's going to be up to them to choose that flexibility and put things in place, whether there's a couple of days that you're working from home and the other days you're working from the office, right? And so for us, we decided to consult and say, right, supervisors are going to assess it. You can turn in a plan for what it is you want to do, talk to the supervisor about it, and then go from there. We encourage from inclusion and HR to be flexible. We told the supervisors, right, depending on what the need of the organization is and what the need of the employee is, that flexibility is going to be key. So we drafted just general guidelines relative to it, and it talked about be flexible and then promote it, right? Like, here, send me how many days you want from home, how many days you want at the office, and you can be general in your rationale as to why that is, because sometimes people just want to stay at home. Listen, Tanisha's been very convenient at the house, and so I just want to stay here. That may not cut it. Just because it's your preference, but obviously depending on childcare, rearing needs, accessibility issues, so on and so forth, then those things can automatically be accommodated. And so as opposed to kind of make it this widespread thing where the executive dean has to approve it, having a one-on-one conversation with the supervisor, asking what you need, and then the top down saying it's going to be okay, whatever the supervisor approves. But then also saying, hey, if that supervisor is being discriminatory, which is to Dwayne's point, having measures in place to come to the Office of Inclusion and other folks to ensure that we can help them through that. So it's a case-by-case basis, because a lot of the times equity needs case-by-case basis as opposed to a straight line.
Thank you for that further depth on that question, and thanks, Dwayne, for asking. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions? I know this chat is loaded up. It always is, which we appreciate. The engagement from the community really, really helps to bring the conversation forward, to move the conversation forward, so we continue these crucial conversations. But not that kind of crucial conversation. I'm not trying to like take people's trademarks or whatever those are called. Any other thoughts or questions from the group?
There's a lot. There was so much information, like my mind is flying in so many different directions. And I know for sure I'm going to be watching the recording of this, because I know the conversations we've had, we've touched upon a lot of these topics before, Dr. King, that you're mentioning, but to hear it all in one place from the perspective that you've shared, I need to sit down and watch that recording again. There's so much valuable information and just perspective that you shared today. And I appreciate, what an amazing conversation to have as our first guest speaker back after a long time. And then on Juneteenth, it really brought back that work is being done, but there's still a lot of work to happen, that there's good work being done, that we shouldn't be discouraged. I definitely get discouraged. Sometimes I feel I'm not doing the work enough or fast enough, but this conversation has sort of brought it that things are happening, might be slow, but we're the change makers and we're the ones who can make that positive impact with the knowledge as we have these conversations, and then go back into our communities and share these resources and these ideas and these perspectives with those in our community, so that there is some type of a trickle effect. Someone can go back to the office and say, hey, this is what I've heard. Any chance we can do some type of flexible remote work, and here are some ideas. And that is part of my goal and our goal with these conversations that we have here each week with our community and with our guest speakers. So I truly appreciate this conversation today. My mind, which is part of why I was so quiet too, because my mind was trying to keep up with everything that you said, and it was all amazing stuff. So thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your perspective with us. Just trying to see if there are any other comments in the, even as I was talking, there's so many comments coming in here.
And I just wanted to leave with this notion and sentiment by Audre Lorde, Black feminist scholar and author, who says, I am not free if any other woman is unfree, even if her shackles look very different than my own. And I think that can be applied to this conversation and future conversations, is that if all of us aren't free, none of us are free. And if we keep that mindset going, I think that can be helpful in continuing the work.
What an amazing quote. Can you tell me again who, I don't know if Tiffany caught it, but I'd love to be able to stick that, the person who said that quote, into the chat as a resource. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much.
I wasn't sure if I understood the name right or whatnot, but I was quickly typing into a separate notes document so I could look it up. Thank you so much. That's awesome. We appreciate you all being here. And, I know many of you join us all the time. Some of you are new, and we really, really appreciate you taking this time on a Friday, on what's now this Juneteenth holiday, to spend time, because I think that we're all here for a reason, because we want to be change agents. We want to see the world be a better place, a more equitable place. And so Suman and I are so blessed and gifted that you all joined us here today, Dr. Tanisha King, and each and every single one of you. So next week, we'll be back to kind of our community connect, where we just connect, check around. I shouldn't say just, where we see, how are you doing? What's on your mind? What topics do you want to talk about? So it's less structured in that way. But every Friday we're here, and we'll be here again at noon this coming Friday on the 25th. And then we actually have more guest speakers coming on July 2nd and July 9th. So we'll get 2 weeks in a row. So please join us anytime you can. If you know anyone who you feel like could benefit from these conversations, you're more than welcome to send them the registration link, the YouTube channel link, which I know everyone in this group has. But if you ever have thoughts, questions, you need a conversation offline, we're here for that as well. So do not be shy to reach out. We appreciate you all for being here. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I know I'll be seeing many of you really soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.